Welcome to The Breach Show. I'm Martin Lukacs, sitting in as host for Doña Ziai in our Montreal studio. Today, we're chatting with our regular panelists, Al Jones in Halifax and Pam Palmater in Toronto. Hey, everyone.
Hey, Martin.
Hey, how's it going?
How are you?
Good, thanks. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Ontario election, where progressive Conservative Premier Doug Ford looks to be leading, despite absolutely mishandling the pandemic. And Pam and Elle will discuss a new report by a group of Canadian senators calling for the exoneration of 12 Indigenous women incarcerated because of systemic racism and sexism. The report comes in the same month as it's announced that Indigenous women now make up half of the female population in federal prisons, despite making up just 4.9% of the population in Canada. Let's start by checking in on what's on people's minds this week. By now, we've all heard about the racist massacre that happened in Buffalo this past weekend. An 18-year-old white man went on a shooting spree at a grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood, murdering 10 people and live streaming the whole thing. The next morning, Catherine McKenna, the former Liberal Environment Minister, took to Twitter with this. Let's bring her tweet up on screen. Reading the news today, I'm feeling very fortunate to live in Canada, a diverse and tolerant country that values freedom while respecting human rights. We aren't perfect, and building our country is an ongoing project, but I wouldn't choose anywhere else. Pam, Elle, your thoughts?
Okay, it's not perfect. Is that code for genocide of Indigenous peoples, slavery of Black peoples, and a total breach of human rights on an ongoing basis and high levels of intolerance and the highest number of white supremacist groups in the world here in Canada? Is that the Canada that's like so much better than the US? Because wow, she's totally devoid of any reality about what's happening here in Canada.
Yeah, you actually gave me this term, Pam, which was maple washing. And I think that's just so apt for, we see this all the time, just on and on all the time, right? It doesn't happen here. This only belongs to the United States. I mean, it's not like we've had multiple mosque attacks and like mass murders and incels driving their vans up on to sidewalks and, you know, Confederate flags being waved at the convoy and, a record number of hate crimes. But, oh, you're happy to live in Canada. Gee, I wonder why you might have a different experience of living in Canada than the rest of us.
Exactly.
What else is on your minds this week?
Al, did you see that story about the police dog and these calls for the province to start paying the vet bills for police dogs and really kind of detached from the abuse that these dogs go through to leave them with such physical injuries that they need such high care after a while?
Yeah,
We've actually got an image of the Toronto Star article. Let me just read out the headline to everyone. Meet Major. He was a very good cop. Now he's retired and expensive.
Yeah, so I mean, for those who don't know, first of all, I'm a police dog truther and abolitionist, so this is why everyone always sends me police dog stories. But secondly, there's a few things with this. So the first is, just the pure, the premise of this article is that cops shouldn't have to pay for these dogs after they retire and become pets. Everybody pays for their pets. People who have support animals have to pay for, and those aren't pets, those are they're working dogs and they pay the vet bills. People who are unhoused have dogs and take their dogs to the vets. The idea that cops, who are some of the highest paid public servants that regularly make over $100,000, if you're a canine handler, you're going to be at the top end of what people are making, are complaining about a few thousand or $100 in vet bills. So that's the first thing. But then the second thing is, if you read the article, I actually did not know how intense the physical injuries and psychological injuries are to police dogs. So they just kind of throw this at us that these dogs all have joint problems because they have to jump in and out of vehicles. They have psychological damage because they're doing these tasks and now the dog is at loose ends and it doesn't know what to do. And it's walking around the house looking to take orders. It can't hang out with other dogs because it's trained differently. And so this is the training of police dogs is actually very violent. It's not normal for a dog to want to grab somebody, bite and hold. Police dog injuries are actually some of the worst and most extreme injuries. There's a Pivot report in Vancouver from 2014 that says somebody in BC is bitten by a police dog every 3 days. And largely that's Indigenous people. And then the whole article is basically if you want to defund the police, you must hate puppies. Like, literally, they're just like, you hate dogs because the dog should have a vet bill. And if you don't want the dog to have like a pension and like a vet bill because it gives the cops more money, then aren't you just an animal killer?
Think about, like, for thousands and thousands of years, dogs were bred to be companions for humans, to live with them in communities. They're pack animals, they're family animals, you know, sometimes they're work animals, but they're also very much a part of the family. And this police training of dogs is the exact opposite. You're literally training them to be able to attack and tear people apart. You're keeping them out of a real pack. I mean, the fact that they can't be around other dogs in the future, you're literally torturing them psychologically and physically. And the fact that they would say, "Oh, look, he was a hero, now he's expensive."
And only
I mean, how many lives did he save? I mean, to categorize this poor dog that way is just really insulting.
And also, even before they become police dogs, only a small percentage actually qualify to be the dogs. And then they have to give the dogs away that fail out of training. There's been cases where they've ended up in dumpsters and dead and in abusive homes. So what it really shows you is police abuse is so extensive. It's not just Black people and Indigenous people. It goes to the animal people as well. Like, you are abusing animals to involve them in this regime of law enforcement. Like, and then you're literally complaining that you might have to pay the dog to go get the treatment from all the damages you caused it by making it be a police dog, which it never consented to.
I think it's time for a doggy union. No, but seriously, like the sub headline of this article was, police dogs retire like any other cop, but they don't get a pension. Should police forces have an obligation to pay for their care? Yeah, obviously, but maybe the Toronto Star would also consider advocating for pensions for like the entire millennial and Gen Z generation.
Well, yeah, the funny thing is that, first of all, if there was a dog union, can you imagine if it was as bad as the human police unions?
Let's shift to the Ontario election. Ontarians will be voting in their provincial election on June 2nd. Currently, the Progressive Conservative Party of Premier Doug Ford is holding a sizable lead in the polls. Let's start with their record. Pam, what do you make of their last 4 years in power?
Well, it makes me worry about if they get another 4 years in power. I mean, they totally mishandled the pandemic. I mean, they did not treat it with the seriousness that it was. It was like they were in denial about all of the hospitals filling up, about the overworking of doctors and nurses and support staff, and the failure in the beginning to really support all of the mandates and to support vaccines and to kind of waver back and forth didn't instill confidence in anybody. Also, where have they been on the Indigenous file? They haven't been, doing too much on the Indigenous file, except his threats that when it comes to the Ring of Fire, that's going to be mined if he has to jump on the bulldozer himself, which pretty much just tells First Nations that their rights and their voice doesn't matter. He's going to go ahead and breach our rights anyway. And so that doesn't bode well for First Nations. And then think about it. Up until the election, he was essentially the enemy of teachers. He was constantly calling down teachers. He seemed to be the enemy of workers. He hated unions of all kinds. He wanted to get rid of the green belt and change these ministerial zoning orders so that he could build endless highways, which, would benefit lots of other people, but not Indigenous peoples, not Ontarians. So he's going into this election with a terrible, terrible record. And I might also add, he failed to give us buck a beer.
Yeah, I think they've really fulfilled this very tired but effective slogan of theirs, which is, opening up Ontario for business. As you mentioned, we've seen this, pretty brutal austerity agenda that has involved rolling back, $15 minimum wage. He's attacked the education sector and teachers, really kind of like a full frontal fight with the teachers union in the middle of a pandemic. He's scrapped paid sick days initially, cut social assistance, and he's also, as the Breach has reported, been pushing privatization of healthcare. And they've also quietly lowered corporate taxes to the point now that they have drained the treasury in Ontario, making the social spending in Ontario the lowest of any province whatsoever. And as you mentioned, they've kind of given their buds in the corporate and development sector, basically a free ride, whether that's in the north or pushing up green space in Ontario, anything for more extraction, more empowerment of the resource industry in the province. And as you say, I think they probably showed their truest colors in the pandemic when, they shuttered parks, they empowered police, gave them new powers, and basically made it seem like the only priority they had was keeping corporate business, manufacturing open, regardless of the cost, especially for the lives of working class and primarily racialized peoples. So a pretty brutal record. What's been interesting is that around this time last year, Ford's polling numbers started cratering. And, his pandemic response or his pandemic mishandling really seemed to elicit widespread outrage and organizing, forcing him to reverse some of these policies. He brought back the 15 minimum wage, he removed those police powers, and he's, as far as I can tell, he's tried to kind of rebrand himself again as a friend of the people.
Oh,
what would you make of that? Pam?
Rebrand? What rebrand? If like the platform is very much centered on highways, billions and billions and billions for highways, and what he calls critical mineral infrastructure. So he's very much about making sure that his friends in construction and that his friends in land development get everything they need on an ongoing basis. Never mind destroy the environment. Never mind, not caring about people who have disability needs, people who have housing needs, all of these things. So, I mean, he's got a interesting video on his website about how wonderful he is. But when you look at his track record, I mean, he's always advocated to give police more money. That's in his platform. He's historically denied systemic racism and has constantly defended the police and wants to give them more power and more money. So I'm worried that people are going to forget about all of that and just look at, what's he been saying in the last couple of weeks, because sometimes people have very short memories.
Yeah, and certainly the media coverage doesn't always help. We actually have a clip of him talking about how he's working for workers. Let's play this clip.
Friends, the progress we've made together in Ontario has been nothing short of extraordinary. Workers across Ontario are all different, and the type of work they do is different. But their work ethic and dedication to building this province unites all of us. That is why earlier this week, our government introduced the Working for Workers Act, our plan to build the future of our great province by taking the side of workers. A plan that will leave nobody behind.
Well, working for workers is like some Orwellian abuse of language, and also it's like a really weak sauce alliteration. I mean, they couldn't do better than working for workers. But let's break it down for a bit. They are trying to rebrand, I think, as friends to workers, which is kind of how he rode a wave of disenchantment with the Liberal Party to power 4 years ago. And it's been interesting to see just in the last few months them unrolling a series of initiatives that sound great in name, but in practice are actually just entrenching and continuing the kind of erosion of workers' rights. So we saw, for instance, a paid sick days program from the government, but it's temporary, it's inadequate, and it's really just an attempt to kind of block the emergence of a real employer-paid sick days program. We also saw them pass what was called a Digital Platform Workers' Rights Act. But it claims to support gig workers, but when you actually look at it, it just like entrenches the misclassification of workers. And even the childcare deal, which the Doug Ford government kind of dragged their heels on, almost as if to just be able to ink it just before the election so they could wave it around. It's the absolute worst deal in the province. It maintains childcare workers' rates at an absolute bargain basement cost. And also what it does is it sends a lot of this federal money, which was supposed to support public childcare. It is ensuring that it's actually going to be supporting the growth of much lower quality private sector childcare.
And keep in mind the hundreds of millions of dollars in federal support during the pandemic, which was critically and urgently needed as social supports and infrastructure supports, and not spending it. Like, to be so spiteful against the prime minister that you wouldn't spend it. You would demand the money. You would say they're not giving you enough, but not actually spend it. And who suffers from that? Right? We're the ones who suffer from that. And where is his Indigenous platform? Did you see? It's 2 tiny paragraphs. First Nations are going to get $1 billion to build the Ring of Fire, roads and highways into the Ring of Fire, but nothing on TRC, nothing on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, nothing on foster care, none of that stuff. In fact, not only more money for policing, but policing in very specific areas, what he calls unregulated tobacco, which is really a dog whistle for First Nation tobacco, because he has been dying to support the convenience store owners and really crack down on First Nations who've had like thousands of years of growing and manufacturing and trading in tobacco, and to trying to end that. So, all of this is a huge, huge problem. Even to date, he hasn't spent all of that COVID money. And so people really need to think about that. Will he be there for you when things continue to go bad, when things continue? I mean, we've got to think about more than just highways.
Pam, the last official debate between the leaders was held on Monday. Did you catch it? What did you think of it?
I wish there were true leaders that would focus on, here's my plan, here's how I'm going to get it done, and here's how it's going to benefit you, instead of, you're bad, no, you're bad, no, you're bad, no, you are. Come on. I mean, they could essentially just have 4 Spider-Mans sitting around all pointing at each other. It's your fault, you're bad, no, you're bad. I mean, what are they doing for Ontarians? Guess who doesn't have a platform? Doug Ford is the only one who doesn't have a platform, so you can't really critique it.
Well, and what did you think of the Liberal Party?
They have some things in there that sound, that it's moving in the right direction, but they're picking the low-hanging fruit, so to speak. And ultimately, his focus for First Nations is unlocking the mineral reserves in the province of Ontario. So instead of really looking at murdered and missing Indigenous women in a holistic way, and the incarceration crisis and all of these things that are really important, the focus primarily is on energy development, extraction, how to get all of the skills training for people to engage in that process. So in that way, he doesn't differ too much from Doug Ford. And that's a problem. I actually expected a lot more. Given that what you see in the Liberal platforms at the national level and in other provinces, it was a really impoverished agenda for Indigenous peoples. And then I didn't see a whole lot that give me any confidence on the environment or tackling racism in the province.
Yeah, and I'd say it's also important to remember that the Tory agenda in many ways kind of continues the Liberal agenda. We saw them, cut in their 10 years in power, cut healthcare funding. They privatized hydro. They attacked the teachers as well. And they only raised the minimum wage after there was a big movement run by the Fight for 15 and for decent work. So, and it was very much on the heels of the Liberal rule in this province that Ford was able to pass himself off as, fighting for the little man. And I've also just been struck by how the Liberal Party and the strategists in the back room, they don't actually seem in this election to be going for a victory. I think that they have been focusing a lot of their energy on trying to sideline the NDP so that they can become the opposition and position themselves as the responsible government, 4 years from now. I guess that leaves the NDP to discuss. What's your sense of how they have campaigned in opposition and are campaigning in this election?
Well, I think that, the campaign, their platform, first of all, like if you compare all of the Spider-Man's platforms, the NDP obviously is the best. They're more social oriented. They care more about the people. They care more about the environment. They care about like everyday issues, which is important. I think more parties should be that way. They have a huge Indigenous reconciliation plan where they actually say the words rights, treaties, a commitment to address murdered and missing, implementing TRC recommendations, like all of this stuff, self-determination, which sounds really, really good. But then if you keep reading, she too wants to unlock the critical minerals in the province of Ontario, but she wants to do it the right way. Make sure Native people get jobs out of it. Well, look, that is not the right way. And while Horvath does have something like her platform is much stronger than the rest of them, we have to keep in mind that you can't just presume that a politician is going to implement their promises. I mean, look at the NDP when they came to power in BC. They had huge First Nations support because they were all about the people and the environment and respecting Indigenous rights and implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And what have we seen since he's been elected? We've seen the RCMP violently invade and arrest and attack Indigenous land defenders in Wet'suwet'en territory, Secwepemc territory, Haida territory, you name it. So there's a vast difference, between what's in a campaign promise and what they do at the end of the day. And that's what makes me a little bit hesitant about the NDP. It sounds great, but some of the provincial NDP governments have been some of the worst across the country, at least for Indigenous peoples.
Yeah. I'm also struck by how their platform on paper is quite good. It's certainly more left-wing and social democratic than any platform they've had in years. But they had 4 years to mobilize and amplify and channel a huge amount of outrage at Doug Ford. And I think they absolutely squandered the opportunity. They either ignored or badly amplified the demands that movements were putting on the table instead of, crystallizing and advocating for them. So it's stunning to me that they did not seize the moment that they were basically given over the last few years. And again, in this campaign, I think that we're not, apart from maybe a few individual MPPs who, like Joel Hardin and Jessica Bell and others who are really, much more boldly campaigning, we're not really seeing Andrea Horwath put what bold policies they do have on the table. We're seeing again a kind of we can be a more responsible government than the Liberals or the Tories can, but they're not really speaking to the fundamental hunger that people have for change in this country and in Ontario as much as any other province.
It's a missed opportunity because they could be saying,
really
here's our plan, here's how it's different, here's how it's going to improve things, like the how of what we're going to do. They could have been building that up, like you said, in the last 4 years. But instead now there's this mad rush and most people don't even know what's in their platform because they haven't been really good about advertising that. Yeah, it's in the platform, but not everybody's a political junkie and goes online and reads all the platforms and all the costing and all of that stuff. So, they're really relying on, what are people seeing in the media and how are they going to improve the lives of Ontarians, and they missed an opportunity to showcase how much, they're talking about human beings and Indigenous peoples and the environment and social supports, which are not just critically important right now. They're going to be increasingly important as climate change goes, as, jobs are an issue, all of those things. And it's such a missed opportunity.
I agree. Well, that's it for this segment. And just so listeners know, on June 2nd, in 2 weeks, we'll be doing a live broadcast on election night with interviews from a wide spectrum of social movement activists and thinkers in Ontario. And of course, your trustee panelists as well will be commentating. So make sure to tune in for that.
So speaking of police dogs and cops and the justice system, Elle, did you see that report that came out from Senator Kim Pate's office this week, which is calling for a review and exoneration of 12 Indigenous women who are incarcerated? Let's take a look at what Trudeau had to say about it.
We have made significant investments in reconciliation on a broad range of issues that has had an impact, but as you point out, there's much more to do. Recent reports have just been appalling in seeing the overrepresentation, particularly of Indigenous women in our criminal system. That's one of the reasons why we've moved forward on eliminating certain mandatory minimums, and that's a bill that's currently being debated at committee right now to make sure that we're changing the system. And as we know, mandatory minimums do lead to a overrepresentation of vulnerable and marginalized people in our criminal system. So this is one thing we're doing, but we know there's much more to do, and we will, because tackling systemic injustice, systemic discrimination, which is real, is a long, hard work.
Okay, so here we go again. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of this country, who acknowledged and accepted the findings of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that found Canada guilty of historic and ongoing genocide, which included the criminalization of Indigenous peoples and the crisis of over-incarceration of Indigenous women in this country. His response to the Senator's report is, you know, we've put a lot of money into Indigenous reconciliation, but, you know, there's always more that we can do. So we have legislation, and we're going to look at things like mandatory minimums. I mean, completely devoid of all of the reasons about how Indigenous people get into prison, what they suffer when they are in prison, and then what are all of these problems, all of these barriers within the so-called justice system to actually get them out and decarcerate these women.
Yeah, I don't know that reconciliation has really made its way into a cell in the max unit of a woman's prison. So the idea of suggesting that anything is reconciled by the number of Indigenous women that are serving life sentences, hard time. If you ever go to a prison, the maximum security units are overwhelmingly filled with Indigenous women, often women who are self-harming, who are suicidal, who are in deep mental health crisis. So show me where the reconciliation is. I mean, that is actually quite insulting to suggest that you've reconciled anything when 50% of women's prisons federally are now incarcerated Indigenous women. What have you reconciled? How on earth is there anything to do other than be completely shocked and disgusted by the fact, and again, this is a report on wrongful convictions. So this is cases like a woman who was being sexually abused by her father and broke into a school to get away and was arrested for breaking and entering, and that's what set her on a path of being criminalized. You know, women who killed their abusers from residential schools, and then somebody else confessed, but the woman is still doing time. It's absolutely sickening, and of course, not surprising in Canada, but the idea of responding to this with anything other than why don't we shut this down and move all these women into community right away is repulsive.
Exactly, because these women do not represent any threat to public safety, as is the vast majority of women in general, Black women, Indigenous women, any women who are in prison. They respond to issues of addictions, violence against them, issues of poverty. They're not there because they represent a threat to the public. And this is one of the things that was really important about this report, because we talk so much about statistics, and 50% is outrageous because women, Indigenous women, are less than 5% of the population. And this has just consistently gone up over the last 20 years. So nothing that they say they've done has worked. But you look at, these are the stories of these women. Now, they're not named, their initials are in there, but you can read all of the injustices that they experienced in their lives, all of the violence, all of the aftermath of colonization, and then they're criminalized and incarcerated wrongly, and then they suffer once they're in prison. I mean, one of the women actually has schizophrenia that was induced from being isolated in the prison. So it's like, it's harmful. It does more harm, and it's not addressing anything. And during the pandemic, in fact, Senator Kim Pate and I were advocating that one of the things we need to do to prevent the spread of COVID in prisons was to start decarcerating. You know, start with decarcerating all of the women, and start with decarcerating kids that are in youth corrections, and then, you know, move on from there. And they didn't even want to hear it. And so here we are in a scenario where we've got this report basically saying everything that's happened in our history, telling the stories of these women, asking for a review and for them to be exonerated. But the core point of this report is these are 12 women, but this represents the stories of all the other women who are incarcerated too. And they're asking for things that are like, get rid of mandatory minimums, like all mandatory minimums, which takes away the judge's ability to provide a sentence that's in any way in consideration of their lives. And we've got legislation before Parliament right now, which is only proposing to take away mandatory minimums for very, very small offenses. So we're nowhere near addressing and preventing future incarceration, and I don't see an actual decarceration plan.
It's also really important to not just talk about things like murder or life sentences, because most miscarriages of justice happen for things like you get arrested for being unhoused and you just take a plea. You're accused of doing something and you're like, I want to get out for my child's birthday, so I'll just say I did it so I can get out of jail. The lawyer thinks you're not worth anything, like, oh, this is just the underclasses, so, just sign this undertaking. So we see the murders as the main thing, but actually the vast majority of this is happening to people on what we might say are minor crimes that often lawyers don't take that seriously and think, oh, what's a big deal? You'll just be on conditions. And then people breach those conditions and end up in these cycles. So we also can't just say, okay, it's these 12 cases. It's every woman that goes and pleads guilty because they threatened to take her kids away. Every Indigenous woman that's being told, well, just testify against this, just say you did it because then we'll just give you this. This is happening all the time. People call it dump truck lawyering. The idea that you just sort of pull up, dump the cases, get a plea and move on.
Yeah, exactly. And the worst part about this is that what it effectively does is it makes any sentence, any conviction, a life sentence in the sense of you're destroying their life opportunities. You're destroying their abilities to potentially get their kids back, to be able to work, to be able to engage or even volunteer in your kids' school's activities. Like, it creates an instant barrier, even if at the small level of smaller convictions. And people don't think about that. And the other really horrible injustice about it is that the Supreme Court of Canada talked about this decades ago and said we need to be finding alternatives to prison for Indigenous peoples, well, all peoples who have this problematic history. But there's already laws within the Conditional Corrections Release Act, Section 81 and Section 84, that provides for people to be decarcerated, that provides for communities to be able to provide supports and housing for people getting out of prison so that they don't have to serve their life in prison. But it's not being used to have a mass program of decarceration of these women. And I think that's the real injustice here. And it does irreparable damage. This woman who has schizophrenia, she's not, even if she gets out of prison, like she is irreparably harmed.
Just a couple of points to add from me, and this is, I think, perhaps my final words on it. One is that what's really concerning, too, is that for so many people, and this includes Black people, prison has become seen as this space where this is where you get access to an elder. This is the first time you get to smudge. This is the first time you go to a sweat. So there's something really disturbing happening where people have been stripped from their land, their languages, their culture, their people for generations in this genocide against Indigenous people. And then you're like, well, when you go to prison, now you can smudge. And so, it's this concern, too, that it becomes almost seen as the only place that we get cultural treatment or engage with our cultures is in prison. So white people, you better not go to prison, but Indigenous and Black people, hey, like this kente cloth, you can, we can put an African symbol on the wall. We'll have more African guards, and now we can all just be Black in prison together. Or, we can just all be Indigenous in the sweat lodge. Like, it is actually a pretty disgusting thing that's happening. And then the last thing I just want to say is Elizabeth Fry Society, Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, last week, I think, had Elizabeth Fry Week, and the focus was on life sentences. And I really encourage people to go and watch those stories. And you hear about how these sentences also follow women for their whole life. If you're on a life sentence, you are never off parole. There are women being told you can't go to Winnipeg. Like, you can't go in Manitoba. You can't go to the province that your entire family is in, that your traditional territories are on. Just being told that, they have to check in all the time. They're being surveyed. If you have a mental health problem, that can be seen as being unstable in the community, and you can be sent back. And women do get sent back. And then you see it go to the next generation, because we also know that the child welfare system so heavily uses these kind of involvements in the system to then say you're going to be an unfit mother, and then take your baby, who then gets involved in the system themselves. So it's also generational. But we talk a lot about defunding the police, obviously, and how policing has expanded. And we need to talk about abolishing prisons and defunding this entire movement of punishment that has just intensified and intensified. And I don't know. I mean, I've never been jumped by. You'd think with like 50% of federal prisons being Indigenous women, like you couldn't walk on the street without some Indigenous woman. Like you should be like strangling me through the screen right now, Pam. Like, so what are these crimes, right? Like are there gangs of Indigenous women? You'd think in Canada that there's gangs of Indigenous women entirely funded by Black men, like, roaming our streets, committing crimes, like, but judging by what our prison system looks like. And again, also Black women, of course, are highly and growing as well, and actually don't have any cultural supports, and literally get policed for things like, we won't give you hair products, and now your hair is falling out. Prisons are a violent place. They are not housing. They are not rehabilitation. They are not social work. They are not healthcare. They are not treatment for drug addiction. They do not reunite your family. They do not give you cultural care. You will not get the help you need there. And we need to stop this new residential school system and this new afterlife of slavery system of incarcerating people for the crime of being poor, colonized, traumatized, wrongfully convicted, miscarried in justice, and facing racist courts and police that will always sentence us more harshly.
Well, let's hope that Canadians take up that call and don't let politicians waver on this and consider it a low priority. Let's hope that this report helps push the issue forward, not just for these 12 women, but for everybody that's in prison.
And that's our episode for today. Thanks to Pam and Elle, and thanks to all of you who tuned in. As always, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Or if you're listening to the podcast version, please remember to like, rate, and share. And if you'd like to help sustain the work of The Breach, please consider becoming a paying subscriber. Go to breachmedia.ca. I'm Martin Lukacs, signing off for The Breach Show. We'll see you in 2 weeks.